All right, I think we'll give it a couple of minutes to get started. Before anyone joins, before other people join, any questions on the last class? Also, I mean, I prefer you speak up. I know you can use the chat too, but I would prefer you guys speak up a little bit. All right, Michael. Anyone else? Go ahead, Michael. Shoot your question. Yeah, you can go and type it out, Michael. So, and while Michael is typing his question up, I didn't have time to look at the assignments. Anya and Isabella, I will try to look at it today and get back to you guys. Okay, so I apologize for that.
Hello.
Hey, Richa.
How's everybody doing? So quiet. I guess there are questions on assignment, and also Anya and Michael are saying they couldn't finish their assignment. So,
Yeah.
are you planning to go over the assignment at the start, Ram?
I was not planning to, Richa, but so basically, I think great. I'm trying to remember. Somebody completed the assignment. I think it was Isabella completed the assignment.
I guess Claire also shared the code on Slack. I didn't get a chance to go through that yet. You want to bring that up? And take a look at it.
Are we supposed to like send you our assignments when we're done with them?
I would prefer Gracie, so I can take a look and I can give you some suggestions, so to make some improvements, right? Yeah, I mean, if you have, if you have not sent it to me so far, you can either send it to me or Richa, even like the earlier assignments, we can take a look and we'll get back to you.
Okay.
Yeah, just so that we know, hey, you're following the proper conventions, I may suggest maybe some optimizations here and there, so.
Have you started recording the session, Ram?
Yeah, I did. Let me see if I can pull that up, Richa. Let's see. So Michael, so your question, right? So basically, what you need to do is you need to iterate over the loop, Michael. Okay, so iterate over your array, right? So you have your numbers array. You will iterate over your numbers array. And if you find the value, right? If you find the value that is passed in as an attribute, right? you can do one of two things, right? You can append the value of the index and then return back, right? So something like, I'll just put some pseudocode in, Michael, so you can basically get an idea of what this is, okay? So basically you'll do a for int I equal to 0, I less than, the array is called numbers array. Something like that, and then let's assume I'm going to initialize my string to be an empty value, Michael. So, and then I will check if, right, I want to get the number at the index, right? So from the array, so I'll say numbers of, get the array and then of I, which will give me the number at a specific index. And if it's equal to the value that's passed, right? So what I will do is I'll set my string to be, return string to be that, and I'll say plus equal to, right? Because I really want to append the value. And then I will say, because I want to return the index, right? So basically I want to return I, something like that. And then eventually I want to return my, something like that, Mike. Either it's a pseudocode, you may have to format this a little bit, so basically, in fact, you may start off with saying that, your initial string may be something like that, right? And then you iterate over the array. If you find your value in the array, right, you basically have to return the index, right? And then you finally return the return string. You may have to put a if conditional to say, hey, if the string, if there is nothing that is present, right, return an empty string. But this kind of gives you a general idea, Michael. If at all there is some value, you should return that. And ideally, if there's nothing, right, you probably want to return an empty string, okay? But this kind of gives you an idea of how do you execute that. And maybe sometime later, Michael, we'll see what are better ways of doing a search. This is kind of just to get you started a little bit. All right, Anya, you can actually submit the assignment once you're done. Anya, I'll take a look. I thought you submitted. I didn't get time, Anya, at least for whatever you submitted, right? That being said, I think we'll go and get started. We are a little over time. So I wanted to touch base on, do a quick refresher on classes. And then I want to see if there are any questions. If there are no questions, I will go over, we'll go over the Kahoot exercise. So I think last week we defined a class called book. All right. So we defined a class called book, my book here. The things to notice, right? The class name and the constructor should be the same. So the constructor is a special type of method. It's similar to other methods, but it's a special type that it's used for initializing your objects, right? By default, if you do not put this constructor in, Java will give you a default constructor with the following signature. Java will give you a default signature, a default constructor without any arguments, okay, by default. But if you implement a constructor like this, at that point, your default constructor is no more valid. You will have to provide a default constructor if you want to utilize your default constructor. The constructor does a couple of things, right? It's primarily to initialize your instance variables. For example, in my book, right? I'm thinking, hey, if it's a book, normally the things I would like to have are name and price, right? Those are the attributes of the book, And the constructor basically initializes those attributes, the name and price. You can initialize other attributes if you want to, internal attributes. But in this case, I'm initializing those two attributes. One way to access the attributes of your object, right, is by using the dot operator. And before I get there, let me just go with this particular statement. So once you create a class, you can create multiple objects of that class. So in this case, I'm creating a Java book, and I'm basically setting the title and price. You can also create a C++ book here, a different book, right? One way to access the attributes of the class are using the dot operator. And I think, Gracie, you may have asked this question last time, and as I was thinking through, I remember that I did not go over that. You asked me, how do you access the method, right? And I did not go over that in the last class. But if you had a method for the book, my book class, right? Something like, let's say the return type is string, get name, and this one basically returns the name, right? So one way to access the methods in the class is pretty similar to how you access the variables. So if you want to get the name, another way you can do it is basically say javabook.getName instead. That's another way to access your methods in your class. And I apologize, I didn't go over this in the last class, but that's the way you access your methods from the class. Then we also talked about what are static variables. Static variables are variables per class and not variables per object. Right? So what I mean by this is title and number, right? They vary by object. So for example, for the Java book, the name is Intro to Java and the value is 7.99, right? The price. But if I want to get the count, right, the count is always going to be for the my book class, So if I get the count after these statements, where I would just initialize the Java book, the count is going to be 1. And if I access the count after I initialize my next book, right, the count is going to be 2. So it's a class variable. The way you access a class variable is by basically giving it your class name and dot variable name. So this is a little different from how you access your instance variable, right? For instance variables, you access it by your object name dot variable. For class variables, you give it your class name dot variable. Okay. Any questions on on classes as such? And we'll go over a couple of more examples, but at a high level, do you guys have any questions on this? All right. So we'll go and get started with the Kahoot. Let me see. How do I start this? Oops, that was right there. All right. Good job, guys. I think everybody got this. Good job, guys. For the one person who got this wrong, yeah, an object is an instance of a class, right? So basically, what we're saying is um, when you say my book, Java book, your object is Java book, right? And so it is an instance of the class my book, So all right, good job, guys. I know that was an easy one, so. Right, I think majority of you got it, but for the one person who got this wrong, uh, you always have to have the new operator when you're creating an object of a class. So that's missing in this statement here. And also, like how you define variables, right? You need to define the type, like when you define variables, like for primitives, you say integer, my int or something like that, right? Similarly for objects, you say your class name, your whatever you want to call your object, and then the difference between primitives and non-primitives is for non-primitives, for objects, basically you use the new keyword, So you have to use the new keyword to create an object of a class. Good job, guys. And this question is primarily to make sure you get the terminology right. So these are called instance variables, or fields. Majority of us will use the term instance variables for a class. Okay. Right. Majority of you got that correct. So we'll go to the next question. Yeah, so I think for the one person who got this wrong, so if you want to access um, like any variables in the class, like for example, if I want to access for my Java book, if I want to access the price, right, I'm going to use the dot operator, or if I want to access a method in my class, I'm still going to use the dot operator, okay? Yep. So a static variable, right? Like for example, count, it's a variable per class, it's not a variable for the object, right? So no matter what, if you look, right, even if you look at count for the Java book or the C book, right, it's always going to be the same, so it's going to return the class value, right? So if you want to access a static variable, right, like count, you can access it by giving it the name of the class and the variable, right? You don't need to create an object of the class. So for example, what I mean by that is you don't need to do, I mean, that's valid, but you don't need to do it, right? You can access it by using the class name dot variable, for static variables, okay? All right, good job, guys. I think everyone got this correct. So, um, Tyra, I think you're, sorry, Mira, you're leading. Good job. For those who got this wrong, so if you looked at the constructor, right? In this case, the constructor has to always have the same name as the class, Um, so otherwise, it's not a constructor anymore, It's a special type of method. For example, in this case, getName is also a method of the class myBook, but it's not a constructor, right? The method that has the same name as a class, right? That's a constructor, and it has a very specific purpose. It's to initialize your class, right? Okay. So it should have the same name as the class, So so if you looked at that code program that I pasted, right? You kind of saw that there was no constructor defined, So that basically means the default constructor used by provided by Java is used, right? So if I basically, let's say, comment all of these out and comment this out, and let's say, I think the code I had was very similar to this, right? So, and if you can kind of look here, there is no constructor defined, right? So by default, if there's no constructor defined, Java provides you a default constructor with no arguments, right? So you don't need to define the default constructor, so. All right. If you kind of saw the screenshot, you kind of saw that there was an error in that screen, right? So the program will not compile. And the reason the program will not compile, right, is if you had like example, right? So let's assume if I defined a constructor, right? If I define a constructor, then you kind of see that the default constructor is not any valid anymore, right? So that's why the program will not compile, So if I have to fix this error, I have to go ahead and basically define the default constructor too, and then this program will compile, So if you go ahead and define your own constructor, by default, Java doesn't provide you the default constructor, so. Good job, Tyra, Neil, Mira. I'm surprised, Tyra, you didn't attend the last class, but you kind of got everything, most of them correct. And Neil, I see you kind of dropped down once the static class was, the question about static was defined. Do you have any questions on the static variable?
No, I get it now.
Okay, cool. All right. The next thing I have for today is, so I have an exercise for you guys, and I want this to be a group exercise, okay? In Java, classes are the most important thing, so I want to spend a little bit more time on this. And it also sets me up for some of the other things I want to discuss. I want to talk about interfaces, and a good way to talk about interfaces is having an implementation for these classes, okay? So I want you all to divide yourself into groups. Each one of y'all, each group, right, will take one of these classes. So for one group, I want you to take square. One group, I want you to take rectangle. And one group, I want you to take circle, okay? And for each of these classes, I want you all to tell me what your instance variables will be. What do you think your instance variables should be, okay? For example, when I defined my book, right, the instance variables I thought were maybe the name and price, right? It's not limited to those, but those are good starters, right? So if you are going to define a class called square or rectangle or circle, right? What do y'all think the instance variable should be, okay? So y'all can divide yourself into, I think we have totally 9 folks. So that'll be 3 groups of 3. And then you can let me know who wants to take up what, and then what those instance variables are, right? And the way I want y'all to do this is y'all can basically, let's assume your group, you have maybe Alia, Isabella, and I don't know who, Tyra, right? I think maybe you're part of one group for your FRC, right? So you can start a conversation directly, like let's say, you can start a conversation like this. So you can, and if you say go, that will create a conversation for just your group, right? And then you can discuss what your variable should be. And once you have defined what your variable should be, let me know. You can basically paste it in the channel, Java channel, okay? So first thing, I want you all to divide yourself into groups. Let me know what your groups are going to be, and then decide which one you want to pick up, which class you want to pick up, square, rectangle, or circle. And then each group, let me know what instance variables you want to define within your class. Before we proceed, any questions on what you guys, what I want you to do? All right, if there are no questions for the groups, right? Who wants to be part of which group? And I hope you can speak up, so I can type it out here.
Alia, Isabella, and I are in a group. I don't know which one we're gonna do yet, but we're in a group.
Alia, Isabella, and Tyra?
Yes.
All right. Got that. The next one, next group. Do you all want me to just choose for you guys?
I can do circle with maybe Michael and maybe Neil.
All right. Was that Anya?
Yes.
Anya, Michael, and who was the other? Neil? And you wanted to do circle?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So the remaining will be part of the other group, I think so. Claire, Gracie,
Mira.
and Mira, yeah. So which one do y'all want to do? The first group or the last third group, right? Which one would y'all prefer? There's square and rectangle left.
We want to do square.
Okay. All right, Gracie, you got rectangle. Okay. And once you have decided what your instance variables are going to be, you can post them in the Slack channel, and then we'll kind of go over the next steps. Do you all have any questions? And the way you all can start a direct communication, like I said, you click on this plus button which says direct messages, go and type up the names and say go, and that should start a channel between just yourself. And once you've decided, go ahead and paste it in the Java channel on what your class name is and what instance variables you would like to, instance variables you want to use. And just as a clue, right? The next thing I would probably want you to do is implement a method called area, right? So that should kind of give you what the instance variable should be for your class, just a clue. Good job, Gracie. But I have a follow-up question. I'll wait for the rest of the group though, And Gracie, the next step I would probably want you to do is go and implement this, right? It's going to be a little tricky on how you want to put it, but your team can basically at least put something in your editors and maybe, share it with the others and see if you agree with your implementation, right? Eventually, I want you to implement the method called area, right? A public method called area, Um, if you want to kind of jump a little bit ahead, that's fine. But I will probably be interrupting you and I want to talk a little bit about these, So, but if your team wants to go ahead and implement the method area, go ahead and do that, So you'll have to create a class called rectangle and then create a constructor, right? And then you create a method called area, Group 1 or 2 for circle and square. And feel free to ask me any questions if you have any questions while you're working through this. And for the squares and circle, right? Before you go ahead and do the implementation for area, I want you to go ahead and give me what instance variables you would like to have, right? Before we go to the implementation. Yeah. All right, Alia. I see your answer. I think we'll probably want to discuss that answer, Alia, but I would definitely agree on some of these, and I think it's pretty much the same for rectangle too, right? But I mean, there's nothing wrong in having all the other variables too, so. And if your group Alia wants to proceed with the implementation of the method called getArea, right? You can go ahead and proceed. And maybe some of the questions I'm going to ask will come out as part of your class implementation, right? So you have to go ahead and create a method called square, right? And then create a constructor, go ahead and create your instance variables in that class, right? And then define a method called area. If you want to call it get area, that's fine too. Or you can just call it area, where the return type is going to be of type double, And even though, I mean, in this case, it may be an integer, there's a very specific reason I want you to return double, okay? And we'll see the reason a little while later, but for now, just make sure your return type is going to be double, So the area implementation will be good job, Anya. I have the same questions, but I think we will probably come back and talk a little bit about this, Anya. But if you want to go ahead and still implement the method called area, right? So I'll go ahead and paste this in the Slack group chat. I think since some of y'all have already started, let's go to the next step. The next step I want y'all to do is I want y'all to go and implement the method called double, right? And which will return the area of a specific shape, right? And I want you to go ahead and put the implementation there. And once you're done with the implementation, you can share your code base. more than it compiling, right? I just want to talk through a couple of things, ideally I would like it to compile, but if you all just want to put some pseudocode together, that's fine too, and then we can probably go from there, but the one question I have for everybody, I know everybody has area in the list of attributes, right? While I agree that you can have area as an attribute, right? But it's something that you can calculate based on your width and length too, right? So I mean, there's no correct answer there. You can definitely have that as an attribute, but the when you create your constructor, right? For example, the rectangle class, when you create your constructor, most probably you will not request the area from the user, right? You'll want the user of your class for rectangle pass in the width and length, right? But the area will be a calculated field that you can either do in your constructor or you can do it some other spot, right? Whenever the user calls get area, right? Or get area, you will basically do width into length. So Neil, you want the sample code? Just give me a minute. I should paste it. But also Neil, the other thing I would say, is after class, right? I would recommend you all go to W3 schools and kind of read up the contents there, so that will help you, okay? But I will go ahead and paste the sample code. All right, Neil, I went and pasted the sample code for you. Gracie, you sent me the code, but I want you to create a method called area, and instead of it just being an instance variable, right? I would prefer you create a method, and there's a very specific reason I want you to do that. So while what you did is not wrong, right? I would prefer you create a method called area. And good job on that, Gracie, by the way. Once you made the change, Gracie, you can basically do an edit on this, and replace it. And you can actually post it in our Java channel, right?
So we're a little lost.
Is that Tara?
Yes.
So Tara, go ahead and ask a question. Maybe I can help you.
Okay. So what we were thinking about initially, since we're a square, we know the area
Yes.
of a square is like the sides squared.
Yes.
So we're like, okay, that makes sense. So you would be like doubling that value number,
Yes. Yep.
but we're not entirely sure how to put that into a code.
So Tara, for the first question I would ask you, let's say, you provided me a class, right, called square to use it, right? So I would not know the area, right? So when you create a constructor for square, you would just take maybe the width or something, right? One value of one side, right?
Yeah.
So that should be a constructor, right? And then if you want to create a area variable within your class, that's fine. But what I would do is, instead of creating an area variable, right? The only instance variable I would have in your class is maybe length, and in my method called area, I would basically return length into length, right?
Yes. Thank
Yep.
you.
Yep. Good job, Gracie. Uh, so while everybody is finishing up their exercise, Gracie, I just have one question. So this is definitely the correct implementation. Okay, and good job on that. So what's the difference? And you don't need to tell me the answer right now, but I would like, when everybody's back in the session, right, class session, I'd like you to answer this question. So what's the difference between using a constructor to initialize the values of the rectangle, right, the length and width of a rectangle, versus basically using a default constructor and setting the length and width by accessing the variable, right? So basically what I mean to say is, instead of this, right, what, like if I basically do something like,
It's more efficient.
yep, that's one reason. That's correct. There's one more reason also, Gracie.
You can have your constructor automatically do other stuff too, like calculate area if you want to.
Cool. And the other thing is initialization, right? So if I do it this way, right? If I do it by line number 39 and 40, basically, if I do it this way, you're not the one, like you will, let's say you are the writer of the class, right? And let's say I'm the person who's actually using this class rectangle, right? I may actually forget to do line number 40, right? And I may say, hey, I just want to calculate the area, right? Obviously, this is a pretty simple example, so it's kind of straightforward, saying that, hey, I need to define both before I need to call my area, right? But this way, by having you use the constructor, right, you're going to make sure that everybody initializes the length and width through the constructor, right? And we'll actually see ways that we can make sure that users are not calling the properties directly. We'll see how to prevent that, right? Because this will be a code smell, right? It can lead to bugs in your code, right? So you don't want to do this. And you want to basically do whatever you have, right? That's the correct way to do it. You want folks to make sure they use the constructor to initialize values. So you can add some validations here if you want to, right? So you can make sure your class is initialized correctly. And we'll see how to make sure that these two variables are not accessed outside your class so that the users cannot basically initialize those values. Does that make sense, Gracie?
Yeah.
Yep. And when you do the FRC program, right, I mean, there may be a need for you to create multiple classes, right? And you'll be using classes created by others, So, I mean, one of the best practices is always use the constructor, to basically initialize objects, And squares and circle, I mean, whatever Gracie posted, right? It's a good reference if you want to use that as a reference, yeah. Good job, Tara. I think I have a lot of questions, Tara, on this. I would wait for the class, and we should probably talk about this, Tara. All right, circles. How are y'all doing? Claire, Neil, Aranya, do you need any help, or you're making progress? Go ahead, Neil. Share your screen.
I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do from here. This is
All right.
all I have.
Cool. So you defined a class called circle, and you have an instance variable called radius. So ideally, I mean, given the radius, Neil, you can calculate the circumference and area, right?
Yeah.
Right. So the first comment I would have, right, is you would probably, I mean, you can define the circumference as and the area as instance variables, right? That is fine, but I would probably stop at defining the radius as a instance variable, right? So I would agree with whatever you have from line 6 to 9, okay? And then
Okay.
you can create a like circumference equal to 2 into pi into radius, which is good. And you'll probably create a similar method, right? Called get area, public double get area, right? You can duplicate. And just say return, it's pi r square, right? And I think Anya has some code, which I will take a look in a bit, but
How do I do squared in
you can
Java?
just do, I think you can use the exclamation, but for now, just do into, just radius into radius. Not exclamation, but I don't know what that symbol is called. I think it's called the cap, but. Right, and do you want to create a main method in here to test this out?
What does that mean?
Oh,
Like,
public static void main. Yep, and then your main method should always take string arguments, right? If you look at the sample I have, Neil, if you want to pull it up a little bit, I can. Yep, it'll be a capital S, right? Capital S.
Oh, yeah.
And give it a space, ARGS. Yep, and then, yep, good job. And then you can say circle. Basically, you're creating an object, right? Creating an object of circle. Say my circle equal to new circle, right? And yeah, give it a value, right? Because your constructor needs a value, right?
In here?
Yes, because what
Um,
you're doing there, Neil, is you're calling the constructor, right? You're basically calling line number 6, right? Line number 6 takes a radius, right? So give it a value, let's say 6.1 or something like that. Cool. Because to get that, you're basically calling the constructor, right?
Sorry, what? Do I put radius in here?
No, give it 6.1, Neil. Just some value. I think the error basically is when you create a constructor, right? You should say circle, my circle equal to new circle.
Oh, okay, that's why.
Yep. And then basically go to the next line and say my circle dot get area, right? Cool. All right, and you can store that in a value and print it out, right? I just want to take a look at what Anya sent me here.
Okay.
All right, Anya, I think, let me go and share my screen. I good, Neil?
Yeah, I think.
Cool.
How do I stop screen sharing?
I think I can.
Oh, there we go.
All right, I think I was, it's good, Anya. I will get back to this. So I'm looking at your code, Anya. So you have a circle, right? And then you created a constructor. I have the same comments, Anya. So when you create a circle, right, you can just pass the radius value. You do not need to pass the circumference and area, right? And like how you have here in this method, you can just call it get area, and you'd say pi into radius, and you would return the area, right? So let me see if I can get your code, Anya, because I'm interested in this, and I want to talk a little bit about this particular class. And one of the questions I was asking Gracie, I'll ask everybody. So while I'm here, I just want to show you all like, normally you all want to format your code, so basically right click on your editor anytime and say source and format, right? That should basically format your code, okay? So that your code looks much cleaner, okay? Since we're here, I just wanted to show you that. Anybody wants to comment on this code here before I make some changes that I think should be made, do y'all agree, disagree? Let me know. And I'm just going to fix some uh, All right. Y'all can speak up and stuff typing. So uh, yeah, I mean, that is one thing, Neil, but I mean, that's not a like a showstopper, right? You know, oh, definitely, sorry, let me take that back. Yeah, you definitely do not want to pass the circumference and area. You're right, Neil, you know, uh, so ideally, right, because you want your class to do the work, right? So you are right. So that is one change I would make. So basically, when I'm defining my circle, I want to take the radius, right? That's good. And then uh, if you want to calculate area, right? That is good enough to calculate the area, right? That's a good comment, Neil. All right. Any other comments on this? Anya, let me know if you agree, right? If I removed the circumference and area from your constructor, Anya, and let me know if you disagree or if you agree, right? Because normally the class, right, you can, for calculating the area, your class can do the work, right? You don't need the user. Let's say if I'm the user trying to use your class, right? I don't need to calculate the area and pass it specifically, right? Then what's the, yep, good job. All right, any other comments? The one other thing I will point out though, I mean, like pi, the value of pi, right, Anya? You didn't, so I know this is just like an oversight, 3.14, I guess, right? And you return the area. I'll not be able to run it yet because I think there is, yeah, maybe I can run it. Yeah, let's see. Yeah, there are some compilation issues here. I'll not be able to run it. No, I can say. So the area is 3.14. Let's say if I do this as 2. Cool. So the area is 12.56. So the one thing I would say, Anya, is, and this is kind of applies to this class, right? The value of pi, right? Can it be a static variable or not? Is pi a class variable, or do you think it needs to differ from object to object, right? Let's say in this case, I created a circle called my circle, right? If I create another circle called my other circle with the radius of 4, right? Will the value of pi be different between my circle and my other circle? So basically what I'm trying to get to is, do you all think we can make pi a static variable? So the question I was asking Isabella is, right, so pi over here is, do you all think it's a class variable or it's a variable per object, right? So is the value of pi going to be different for my class and my other class, right? For sure, I know the radius is going to be different for my class and my other class, right? So for my class, the radius is 2, and my other class, the radius is 4, right? But the value of pi, right? Is it going to be different between these two classes? Can I make that instance a static variable instead, so that it is a variable per class and it's not a variable for an object, right? Yep, that is correct as well. So it should be the same, right? So basically you can think of it as a class variable, right? No matter how many circles you define, the value of pi should be the same, right? So instead of making it an instance variable, right, I will make it a class variable instead. Do you guys have any questions, comments on what a static variable is? Because a static variable is a variable per class. It should not vary from object to object, right? But like radius can vary from class to class, because my circle can have a different radius, my other circle here can have a different radius, right? So I cannot make these as instance variables. But value of pi, definitely I can make it as a static variable. Do you have any questions on the static variables now? Gracie, any questions on static variables?
No.
Cool. All right. Anybody else questions on static variables? While I am here, I'm going to introduce one other concept. The value of pi should not change. Would you all agree with that? So I, as a user, should not be able to change the value of pi. Let's say you have provided me a circle class, and I should not be able to change the value of pi, right? So I can make it a final value. I'll declare that variable to be a final. So basically what that means is nobody can change that value of pi, okay? So basically I've introduced a new concept here, so whenever you're declaring a variable, if you do not want anybody to change it, right? So you will go ahead and make that final. Okay, questions on that? All right, if there are no questions, I'm going to ask the question that I asked to Gracie, right? So what is the difference, and maybe for that question, maybe I should basically go back to this example. It's a better example. So the question I asked to Gracie was, what is the difference between this, which Gracie provided, which is the correct implementation, right, versus me doing something like and calling assume, right, there was a default constructor, and right, and calling. So what is the difference between what Gracie did earlier, right, where she initialized the constructor, she initialized the values using the constructor, versus me, if I, instead of whatever Gracie did, right, if I do rectangle do y'all see an issue here if I do it this way, right? So basically, if I initialize my rectangle with the default constructor, and I initialize my instance variable using the dot operator, right, instead of actually using the constructor to initialize my values, So the difference between this line here, line number 26 and 27, is in 26, Gracie initialized it correctly, which is she used the constructor, right? But here, we're initializing the rectangle, but we're not using the constructor. Instead, I'm initializing the instance variables by calling the dot operator and setting the field, right? So which do you all think is better? The way Gracie did, or the way this is the other option, right? And why do you all think one is better from the other? Anybody wants to take a shot at that? Anya, do you want to take a stab at that question? Isabel, I think you're not exactly, Isabel. I mean, like the efficient, it's not truly efficient, okay? And easier to read is probably not the reason. Like there's one more reason. Let's assume, Isabella, like if you were, like in this case, right, Gracie defined the class, right? But in a real world, right, you're not going to be using the classes that you created, right? You'll be using the classes that somebody else created, And assume if in this case, I actually am using Gracie's class, right? So if I don't initialize, I forgot to initialize the length, right? So is that an error now? If I forget to initialize the length, it is an error, right? Because if you want to initialize your rectangle correctly, you have to initialize the length and width, right? So if I call get area here without initializing my length, I may get an error, right? So the purpose of the constructor is obviously not only to allocate memory, but also to make sure that, the initialization happens correctly, right? So the only, if at all, you give the user the option, the only option you give the user to create your constructor, is through basically this mechanism, right? So you don't give the user this way to create your class. That basically means that forces me as a user to create my object using this constructor, right? That way you can control the correct initialization of your class, right? So basically it is more to prevent errors, Isabella. So that if constructor is the way to initialize your class, you will make sure that everything that needs to be initialized when a rectangle is created, right, is passed, right? That's one way, and also what you can do, right, to make sure I do not do this, right, is you can make the variables private, okay? And normally you will not have a public static void main within your class, okay? You will have the general way, right, is you will have another class to initialize your rectangle, right? So a sample would be Isabella, so you would basically create a main rectangle class, and that's how you initialize your rectangle, okay? And if you kind of see, I've initialized my rectangle class here. And if I try to access the values, right, you can see I'm not able to access the width nor the length here. And the reason I cannot access those is because I made these two variables, the width and length, private, okay? So by making them private, you will not be able to access these variables outside your class. So one way you can make sure that the users are not initializing the width and the length, right, is to make them private. And so when you make them private, they will not be accessible outside your class, okay? The scope of your class is between this brace and this brace, okay? So let's assume if I create a new class called a main class, right? And in my main class, I want to create the rectangle. And if I want to basically access those variables, right, I will not be able to, okay? In fact, what you have to do, in this case, I want to access the area, right? So let's go ahead and see if I can access the area method here, okay? And if you kind of saw that Gracie made this area method public, okay? So let's see if I can access get area here. See, if I make the method public, I can access the area method, okay? So your question, Isabella, like, what if you make them not private, okay? That's your question, right? So is that your question, Isabella? If I remove the private, yes. So if you don't make them private, Isabella, okay, what will happen is you can still access them within your package. So I've not talked about packages yet, Isabella, okay, but and I intend to cover it before the end of today. But the thing is, a package is just a directory, okay? So in this, so let's assume this com.pojo is a directory. So if at all your class is within the directory, like for example, my main rectangle class is in the same directory as my rectangle class, right? So if it is within the package, you will be able to access the variables, okay, if you don't define private over there. So by making this private, right? So let's say I can set the value here, right? So it compiles here now, but you still don't want the users to do this, right? Because that's not the correct way. So what I will do is instead you make these private. Now, if you make this private, you will not be able to access the private variables even within your package, So you see in my package, right, my main rectangle is in the same package, right? So by making it private, I'm basically removing that access, Does that answer your question, Isabella, or do you want me to go over that again? Cool. So basically, the correct way, just to summarize, right? The correct way to create your class is always using a constructor, okay? And you do not want others to create your class and initialize values like the way we did here. Just because, others, right, they may forget, right, to initialize the values correctly, So if you say the only mechanism to create a class is by basically providing a constructor which takes the initial values, right? That way you can validate within the constructor if at all those values are valid or not, right? So that way you can make sure that if I'm using your class, and I can create it correctly, right? Couple of ways you can do that, right? By making sure that the variables in your class, like the width and length, are declared as private variables. When you declare them as private variables, that means that you will be able to access the private variables only within your class, right? So in this case, right, I was able to access my width right here, but in Java, right, you would never, having a main method here is just for test purposes. You would have hundreds of classes, so you would never create a main method like this to test your class, okay? This is just for, in a real world project, you will never have a main method like this, okay? In fact, you may have a method like this where you actually create a class, you'll have a separate class where you actually create your objects, right? And in your project, which has hundreds and hundreds of classes, right? You will have only one method, which will basically initialize your whole project, okay? So going back to the access modifiers, right? By making a variable private, you can access that variable only within your class. If you remove the private variable, private declaration over there, you can access that that variable in your package. Right? But you don't want to do that. In order, so but if you, so that's why I said, make sure that this thing is private, okay? And by making something public, right? That basically means it's accessible everywhere in your whole project, okay? And that's why right now I've shown you package level access, but let's assume I created this main rectangle in another package, right? Called com.frc, right? I should still be able to access the public methods, okay? So quickly we touched based on what our access modifiers are. So access modifiers are basically public and private. So private basically means you access things only within your class. Public means you can access it everywhere in your project. And the default, right? Basically, if you do not have anything here, that is the default access. Default access is basically you can access these variables within your package. Okay. When I say package, it means that, just a folder structure. Okay. That's what we mean by package. Any questions on the access modifiers? So basically the public and private, they're called access modifiers. Anya, any questions? Neil, Claire? Cool. All right. Since I touched base on packages, right? So let's assume you create a package. So the way to create a package is basically you say go new and create a package, right? So you can create a package like that. I'm just going to create a new package. Let's say com.frc.students, That's the way to create a package quickly, okay? And let's assume I want to create a new class within my package, right? So let's say my test rectangle. So that is a class that I'm going to create within my package, right? So the first thing you'll notice is the first line, right? If you create classes within your package, the first line has to be the package name, right? In this case, I'm creating my class called my test rectangle within the package called com frc students, right? So I always have to start my class with the package name, okay? That's one thing you'll notice when you create a package. And let's assume in this case, I do want to test my the rectangle that Gracie sent me, right? So basically I will say rectangle, and you kind of see the suggestions, right? You're saying, hey, there is a rectangle is com.pojo, right? I basically put the class that Gracie sent in this package called com.pojo. So let's say I'm going to import that guy. And as soon as you see when I did that, right, it basically went and said import that class because that class was in a different package, right? So if you want to use a class in a different package, you got to say import and give it the name of the package dot the name of the class, okay? And I'll say to right, and the width is 10, and the breadth is 12. Cool. So just to summarize, so packages are basically just a way for us to organize a code, okay? And normally the convention that we use is com.company name. In this case, we don't have a company, right? I'm just going to say FRC and students package, And in that package, I'm creating a class. And as soon as I create my class, the first thing you got to make sure if you create your class within your package is make sure that you have the package statement, okay? And I want to use the rectangle class that, was part of this com.pojo package. That's the thing that Gracie sent me. I just put it in a package called com.pojo. So if I have to use that, so what I have to do is import that in my class where I want to test this out. So com.pojo.rectangle, and then I can use that rectangle that we just created. Any questions about packages and how do you create things, how do you create objects, how do you access methods within an object. Do you all want me to summarize things once more? Do you all have questions about access modifiers? When I say access modifiers, right? Basically, private is an access modifier and the other access modifier is public, you know? And if you go to W3 schools, there is, you will see a specific line item for access modifiers. But if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. All right. No questions? Claire, Mira, any questions? All right. The next thing I will cover, let's look at square. Are you still there, Tara? Alia? Tyra or Alia or Isabella? Cool.
I'm still here.
Cool. So the first question I have, right, for your thing is, I do like that you have a constructor, right? So you probably do not need this, right? Because you know the length in both, in this case, right? Both the length 3 and length 2 should be the same, right? So you probably don't need that, right? And let me know if you disagree, okay? So I would make that change, right? So we know, hey, we need only one variable, right? And since I named it, since you sent it to me, I changed the name of the class. So maybe I have to change this here. So that's one change I would make, right? Then I see you have a method called getArea, which is good. And you're saying area is length into length and you return the area, which is good. The question that I have for your team is, will this be a static value? Will the length be a static value? Since we have kind of talked about statics, right? Any Alia or Isabella or Tyra, would you all think length should be a static value or should it not be a static value? Or anybody from any other, like, you know, if anybody. Yeah, the question, Anya, is like, for example, in your case, right, rectangle, we didn't make width and length static, right? But in circle, the radius is not static, right? But we decided pi is static because pi is same for all the classes, right? Going back to square. Cool, that's good, Isabella. Yeah, it should not be, right? Because each square that I declare, right, should not have the same length, right? So for example, if I say so my second square should have a length of 4. If I make it static, what will happen is as soon as I make it static, both my square and my second square will have the value that is the latest, you know, it will change to 4. So my square will also have the value of 4 if we make it static, you know. So that's the problem, right? So good job, you know, should not be static. All right, so I think we covered what a class is, you know, I mean, we've refreshed what a class is. We have also talked about what access modifiers are. We've talked about packages, you know, how to create things within package. And also just to refresh everybody, right? Normally, this is good for testing, right? But the convention is you will normally not have a main within the same class. You'll create another class like here, which has the main method, okay? And in a project, in a general project, right, you will have thousands and thousands of classes, right? You know, so you'll have only one method in your whole main, in your whole project, okay? For this purposes, for now, let's start using, if you want to create a main method, let's make sure it's outside the rectangle class, right? Or your square class or whatever, right? Do you all have any questions so far? All right, I think we are out of time. So I'll be posting exercise for you guys to do, but this exercise is not a coding exercise. In fact, this is more to just kind of go over what do you think your classes should be and what variables should be within your class. I think since we are out of time, I probably may not actually go with this if I don't find it. Let's see if I can find it real quick. Yeah, I'll go with this real quick in 2 minutes. So basically, I want you all to, as part of this exercise, right, I want you all to figure out what your classes are going to be, what your instance variables of the class are going to be, and what methods are going to be, okay? No need to write an implementation, just a rough draft of, hey, here's what your classes are going to be, and here's what your methods in your class is going to be, okay? So what I want you all to do is assume you're going to develop an e-commerce application that sells books, okay? And each book has the following attributes, a title, author, price, and description, and category. And the category values can be one of these, drama, fantasy tale, horror, or programming, So my assumption would be if you're going to do an e-commerce application, one of your classes is going to be book, okay? And the other thing I said is, in your e-commerce application, users can browse through a list of books and purchase a list of books, So maybe you need to have a class called user, and the attributes of the user, right, are email, name, and address. Anya, no. For at least for this exercise, right? Not right now, right? You do not need to input anything, okay? As we go later in the course, we may develop this application, okay? This is just an exercise for you to figure out, hey, what your classes are going to be, what your instance variables are going to be in your class, and what your methods, right? Because in object-oriented programming, at the end of the day, organization of your figuring out what your classes should be, that is what is important, okay? Even in FRC, right, when you basically, let's say, start your FRC project, you may take a step back and say, hey, I think I need all these things, right? I need to implement all of these. What should my classes be, if you're going to write some custom classes, okay? So this exercise is to kind of get you thinking through what your classes should be. So the user has the following attributes: email, name, and address. And at the end of the checkout process, right, you should be able to see what my list of books are, and I want to see for each book what my price is, and I want to be able to calculate the total price, right? So in addition to the user having these attributes, maybe you want to have another attribute called list of books, maybe, so I'll go ahead and post this in your in the Slack channel. So like I said, the goal of the exercise is just not do any coding, okay? Just to think about what your classes should be, and for your classes, right, what should be the instance variables, okay? All right, I think I am done for the day, and I didn't realize I'm already half an hour over, but any questions, I'll be happy to stay around and answer them. Otherwise, y'all can, if there are no questions, you can drop off. Anya, Michael, do you guys have any questions or?